Welcome to the complete animation of Gwendolyn from the 1997 animated feature film The Fearless Four. The Fearless Four is an animated adaptation of an old story called The Brementown Musicians, which follows the adventures of a rooster, cat, donkey, and dog as they form up to become a band of musicians and go to a town called Bremen to perform. So, I'm not really familiar with the Brementown Musicians. I've basically heard the synopsis of the plot because of this movie. And from what I've heard of it, it seems like this movie is only very loosely based off of the source material. And what this movie really does is do a lot of things that I would consider to be almost intentional nightmare fuel for kids. Because, there's a bunch of people who talk about how old animated movies were almost intentionally traumatic for children. And then they point at movies like The Secret of Nim and The Land Before Time and maybe even The Black Cauldron. And to be honest, I don't see it for a lot of those movies. A lot of those movies don't really seem like they are all that scary. Especially like An American Tail. Sure, there are some images that are maybe a bit startling, but I think that people overplay just how traumatic these movies really are. But I think that The Fearless Four is a movie that sort of intentionally tried to harness some of that, especially later on when there's like a tickle torture scene, which is either meant to intentionally frighten children or is, just another episode of Meet the Writer's thinly veiled fetish. But visually, The Fearless Four is interesting. The Fearless Four, it begins with mostly regular hand-painted backgrounds and hand-drawn characters, and the hand-drawn characters are there throughout. But then one of the interesting things they do is they have a juxtaposition between the regular sort of backgrounds and characters and the backgrounds and characters that you see when you meet the big mega corporation. And the big mega corporation, their background is all CGI. And it does make a big juxtaposition, but because of the way that it works, it fits. It's not like a movie like Titan AE, which was Don Bluth's last animated feature, where Titan AE, it tried to do what Disney would end up doing with their deep brush technology, where they would have 2D characters interacting with 3D assets. And I think that The Fearless Four, in many ways, its CGI backgrounds were better, even though, they were more primitive. They don't have very good textures. It feels like, a 90s CG render, because that's what it is. But because of the way that the movie frames it, I think it works better. Because in Titan AE, oftentimes it just looks, so this is a special effects shot, which means that now the background layer is all CGI and the characters need to be drawn into it. Or even a bunch of Disney's deep brush sequences. They really just don't hold up that well. They really just look like 3D objects that are in a 2D movie. So I think that the primitiveness and the intentionalness of the backgrounds later on in The Fearless Four is actually pretty well done. Now, the story itself doesn't seem all that intelligible. I don't know if that's the right word. The story itself, the characters don't feel like they ever really have all that much chemistry. Like, they're together the entire time, but it doesn't seem like they really have any good conversations with one another. A bunch of it is just them discussing the events that are happening almost as if they're all one character having an inner monologue. The characters don't really get to have those good, deep, personal conversations where they reveal more about themselves. Because honestly, the characters themselves don't have that much of a backstory. They each come from a place, and humans basically abandoned them, and so they felt the need to run away, and now they're together. The one of the best bits of character development, especially relationship development, I think I've seen in recent years is when I rewatched Tangled, because you get a whole lot of really good conversations between Rapunzel and Eugene. They meet, they talk together, and they talk about how they don't really want to be around each other, but Rapunzel needs Eugene to help her live out her dream, and Eugene really just wants, his payday. And so it starts out there, but then they are constantly talking and having conversations with each other, and like the two biggest scenes, I think, are when they're walking through the tunnel underneath the Snuggly Duckling, where they talk a little bit more about themselves, and then just after the big, dam breaking scene where they talk next to the campfire. Like, those two scenes on their own have more character development and relationship development than many movies have in their entire runtime. I just barely watched Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, which is a movie with a ton of really good ideas, but holy cow, the lead characters, Joe and Polly, do not have chemistry. So the Fearless Four, even though all these four animals are together the entire time, they often feel more like they are closer to a Joe and Polly type relationship than a Rapunzel and Eugene type relationship. So one of the interesting things about The Fearless Four is that it was made in Germany by a German animation studio, and I think this is one of two German animation movies that I'm really familiar with. I think the other one is Felidae. And I have many things to say about Felidae, but suffice it to say, I think that Felidae is a better executed movie, but it is so firmly an edgelord project that I don't know that I can really recommend it. Felidae is... It's like, how there's adult animation, and the way that most adult quote-unquote animation works is they do all the things that you don't see in, animation geared towards children. And so there's just a whole bunch of violence and swearing and sex. And it's like they're doing it for the sake of doing it. They're not doing it because it actually helps with anything in the story. Felidae is firmly planted in that tradition of adult animation. And I do not appreciate that. What I do appreciate in adult animation is stuff like, Genndy Tartakovsky's Samurai Jack Season 5 or Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal. That is how you do adult animation right. Where, yes, there is violence, but it feels more necessary. But here in the Fearless Four, they do everything they can to have some of that edginess of adult animation without actually going there. And the whole plot of the company that they're singing for actually grinding up animals to make sausages, it feels a bit weird because, you know, they're saying things like, we don't want animals to be processed into food, but then, you know, where else are we going to get our animal products? And if you look at the animals here, there's a cat and a dog. They're both predators. Like, they gotta eat, and usually that's meat. Like, there's this mouse character, and you're like, come on, Gwendolyn, why aren't you just eating the mouse? So, this movie was made in Germany by a German animation studio, but it was distributed by Warner Brothers. And I honestly can't tell what audio track the lip sync is keyed to. Sometimes it seems like the English fits what the mouths are moving. Sometimes it doesn't. But I tried watching, you know, the German version online, and it just doesn't seem like the German fits the lip sync either. Which is one of the things that I really like in animation. One of my favorite things in all of animation is when characters' mouths move perfectly to the audio track. Just good lip sync is one of the things that I find the most deeply satisfying, where you could turn the audio track off and you could get a pretty good guess of what the character is saying just because of how their mouth is moving. And this movie doesn't do too much of that. Overall, I'd say that this movie feels a bit mixed. It feels like a higher budget. It feels higher budget and higher production values than, you know, a straight-to-video animated feature. But at the same time, it doesn't quite feel like it is a proper full-length animated feature. It's kind of hard to explain, but the quality of this movie just feels like it's at a middle ground that I'm not very familiar with. And I don't think that the movie overall is really all that good. It's not terrible or bad. It's just not that good. Of course, in this day and age where everybody must have the absolute most die-hard opinions about everything. I mean, just talk to anybody about Kung Fu Panda 4. Like, the true fans, quote-unquote, all hate the movie, and they say that anybody who does like the movie obviously isn't a true fan because the movie just missed the mark. It's like, that is the era that we live in today. With the online discourse, you must have die-hard opinions. And so when someone like me comes around and tries to have a more nuanced opinion and talk about, you know, parts of a movie I like and parts I disliked and how, you know, maybe the entire movie isn't my cup of tea, but I don't want to dismiss it outright, that doesn't really gain traction, because what gains traction these days is emotion-fueled absolutism. Like, if you're gonna make, you know, your long video essay, you better have a strong thesis and stick to it. And if you try to be a little more nuanced in how you view something, then it's just not going to gain traction because it doesn't incite the emotions. Like, the most popular video reviews are usually the ones that are just, this movie sucks and here's why. Or, this movie is underrated and here's why. And, you know, I'm getting a bit tired of it. I want more nuance. I want more sincerity and fairness in my online discourse about movies. And I don't really see that very much. Like, I used to watch some channels that reviewed animated stuff, but I don't anymore because a bunch of them seem to have just lost their way and are more concerned with eliciting emotions rather than having a sincere view of things. And it also doesn't help that a bunch of critics are just completely wrong. Like, there's this one critic who was famous for years, decades even. I think his name was Roger Ebert. And holy cow, I've listened to, not listened, but I've read some of his reviews, and I just don't understand how he could ever be popular. He completely misses the mark on so many movies. And I doubt he reviewed this one. I would be genuinely surprised if Roger Ebert wrote a review for the Fantastic Four. I mean, one of Roger Ebert's reviews was for a movie that is, fair enough, very divisive, called Napoleon Dynamite. Now, Napoleon Dynamite came out in the early 2000s, and it was one of, the indie breakout hits, where very short budget and just a few characters, but it tells the story that it wanted to tell, and a lot of people, that movie resonated with them, and a bunch of people, the movie did not. It is a divisive movie. And guess what? Roger Ebert was one of the ones who didn't like it. And you know what his review said? Practically nothing. His review was basically just him reading off the IMDb page of characters and maybe one or two snippets about what the character did, and then the name of the actor. And it's like, this is the guy who everybody thinks writes really good movie reviews? He didn't get to any of the meat of the movie at all. He really just rattled off character names and actor names, and the entire time was dismissive of the movie. He never actually got to the meat of the movie. Like, Roger Ebert, such an overrated critic. In fact, I think all critics are overrated. I am perfectly capable of formulating my own opinions, and I don't need someone else to give me my opinions for me. And my opinion about The Fearless Four is that it's an interesting movie, but not a terribly good one. I do think it's worth watching for people who think they might be interested, and it's certainly worth watching for people who want to broaden their horizons for animation. Now, one of the things about The Fearless Four is that it had a bunch of censored parts. So this part right here, I had to find on YouTube because it is not included in the English version. And, fair enough. It's, the cat coming on to the guy in order to get what she wants. There were other censored parts as well, but thanks for watching.